Mercedes and Red Bull are now under investigation after using a legal engine trick that secretly gave them up to 136 extra horsepower, right where races are decided. That's not just an advantage. That's the difference between pole position and losing control before the race even starts. And for 3 race weekends, nobody stopped it. No penalties, no warnings, nothing. Because technically, it wasn't cheating. But here's where everything changes. New evidence shows this wasn't just clever. It was precise, repeated, engineered to activate at the exact same moment every single lap. And that's what triggered the FIA. Because now, this isn't just about speed. It's about intent. It's about whether a safety system was turned into a weapon. And if that's true, this doesn't just disappear quietly. This could change results. It could shift the championship. And it could expose something much bigger happening behind the scenes in Formula One. Because once that new evidence appeared, the entire situation changed. This is no longer about a loophole. It's about a system that behaved too perfectly, too consistently, too precisely to be ignored. Because when the FIA looked deeper into the data, they didn't just see a gain. They saw repetition. The exact same shutdown point, lap after lap. The exact same behavior in the final meters. The exact same outcome every time. And that's where the real problem begins. Because in Formula One, nothing natural looks like that. Real systems fluctuate. Energy varies. Conditions change. But this looked controlled. Programmed. Engineered to deliver the same result under pressure. And that's what raises the biggest question of all. Was this just a clever use of the rules? Or was it designed to exploit something the rules never intended? Now think about how much control that requires. This isn't a driver making a split-second decision. This is software, energy maps, predefined triggers, all working together to hit one exact moment, right before the finish line, every time. And once the FIA sees that level of coordination, they stop looking at performance. They start looking at intent. Because intent is what separates innovation from something else entirely. And that's where Mercedes and Red Bull enter dangerous territory. Because if the FIA concludes this was deliberate, then the story changes completely. It's no longer about finding an advantage. It's about how that advantage was created, who approved it, how far it was tested, how many times it was used, and whether it crossed a boundary that wasn't obvious at first. And this is why the investigation is expanding, not just across laps, but across entire race weekends, looking at patterns, looking at consistency, looking for proof that this wasn't just possible, but intentional. Because if that proof exists, then the consequences don't stay small. They grow into something that could affect results, standings, even the perception of the season so far. And that's the tension building right now. Because nobody knows how far this will go. But everyone understands one thing. If intent is confirmed, this won't just be remembered as a clever trick. It will be remembered as the moment everything went too far. And this is where the investigation becomes something much bigger than anyone expected. Because once the FIA starts focusing on intent, they don't stop at the surface. They go deeper. Into the system itself. Into how it was built. How it was triggered. How it behaved under every possible condition. And that's where the most important detail begins to emerge. This wasn't just a one-layer trick. It was a sequence. A chain of actions, perfectly aligned. Battery usage mapped across the entire lap. Energy drained at a controlled rate. So that by the final straight, everything was exactly where it needed to be. Low enough to trigger the situation. But not empty. Not random. Precise. And then, at that exact moment, the system shuts off. Every time. Same place. Same timing. Same result. And that level of control is what changes everything. Because now, it's not just about what the driver does. It's about what the car is programmed to do. Automatically. Silently. Without variation. And once that becomes clear, the FIA isn't just looking at telemetry anymore. They're looking at architecture. At the logic behind the system. At the decision-making built into the car itself. And that opens a completely new dimension. Because if this behavior is embedded, then it's not isolated. It's part of the design philosophy. Part of how the car was meant to operate. And that's where responsibility expands. It's no longer one department. It's not just one idea. It's a coordinated approach. Engineers, software teams, strategists, all aligned around one objective. Extract performance from a space nobody else understood. And that's why this is so difficult to judge. Because on one side, this is exactly what Formula One is about. Innovation, precision, pushing boundaries. But on the other, this touches something more sensitive. A system designed for safety, used in a way that creates unpredictability. And that's the conflict at the center of everything. Because the FIA now has to decide, not just if it was legal, but if it was acceptable. And that difference is massive. Because legality is written, clear, defined, but acceptability, that's interpretation. That's judgment. That's where things become uncertain. Because once you move into that space, there are no exact limits, no exact lines, only decisions. And those decisions set the tone for the entire sport. So now, every team is watching closely. Not just to see what happens to Mercedes and Red Bull, but to understand where that invisible line really is. How far you can go, how much you can push, before the sport itself pushes back. And that's why this moment matters more than it seems. Because whatever the FIA decides will not just close this case, it will define the next one. And this is where everything reaches its breaking point. Because once the FIA has the full picture, the full data, the full pattern, there are only two possible outcomes. Either this was a brilliant interpretation, pushed to the absolute edge of the rules, or it was something more. Something that crossed a line, that wasn't clearly written, but clearly exists. And that decision changes everything. Because if the FIA concludes this was simply innovation, then Mercedes and Red Bull walk away with something powerful. Validation. Proof that they saw something others didn't. That they operated at a level ahead of the entire grid. And in Formula One, that kind of advantage is respected, even feared. But if the FIA decides otherwise, if they believe this crossed into deliberate exploitation, then the consequences won't be quiet. They won't be subtle. They will be immediate. Because now, it's no longer about removing a trick. It's about correcting an imbalance. And that could mean everything is re-examined. Lap times, qualifying sessions, even the early narrative of the championship. Because once intent is confirmed, you can't ignore the impact. And that's where the real tension is. Because right now, nobody knows which direction this will go. Not the teams, not the drivers, not even the fans. But everyone understands one thing. The decision is coming. And when it arrives, it won't just explain the past. It will define the future. Because this moment sets a precedent, a boundary, a reference point for every team moving forward. How far can you go when the rules leave space? How much can you exploit before it becomes too much? And that answer will shape everything. From car design, to software strategies, to decisions made under pressure in the middle of a qualifying lap. Because from this point on, every engineer is thinking differently. Every idea is being questioned. Every advantage is being tested, not just for performance, but for risk. And that's the real impact of this story. Not the trick itself, but what happens after. Because once the FIA draws that invisible line, everyone has to respect it, even if they can't see it clearly. So as the investigation reaches its final stage, everything comes down to one last question. Not how the trick worked, not who used it best, but something much deeper. In a sport where every thousandth of a second matters, where every advantage can decide a championship, how far is too far? And who decided to find out first? And this is where the story reveals its final truth. Because after all the data, all the investigation, all the tension, the real impact was never just the trick. It was what the trick exposed. Because what Mercedes and Red Bull found wasn't just an advantage. It was a weakness. A hidden gap inside one of the most complex rulebooks in motorsport history. A moment where a safety system could be turned into performance, without breaking a single written rule. And that's the part that changes everything. Because Formula One is built on precision, on control, on the idea that every variable is understood. But this situation proved something else. There are still areas where interpretation becomes power, where understanding the system matters more than the system itself. And that's why the FIA had to act. Not to punish, but to protect the integrity of the sport. Because if something like this continues, then performance stops being about speed, and starts being about who can bend the rules the furthest. And that's a direction Formula One cannot allow. So the FIA didn't just stop the trick. They closed the gap. They made the invisible visible. They turned something untouchable into something controlled. And that resets everything. Because now, every team knows the truth. Even if something is legal, even if it works perfectly, even if it gives you a decisive edge, it can still be taken away. If it crosses a line that wasn't obvious at first. And that realization is more powerful than any penalty. Because it changes behavior. It changes strategy. It changes how teams think before they even build the car. And that's the real consequence. Not what happened to Mercedes. Not what happened to Red Bull. But what happens next. Because from this moment on, every innovation carries a new question. Not just, does it work? But, will it survive? Will it stay invisible? Or will it become the next thing everyone is forced to stop? And that's the cycle of Formula One. Relentless. Unpredictable. Always evolving. Because for every trick that is exposed, another one is already being created. Somewhere. Quietly. Carefully. Waiting. And when it appears, it will look just as normal. Just as legal. Just as unstoppable. Until one moment, one question, one detail, changes everything again. Because in the end, this wasn't just about a trick being banned. It was about something much bigger. The moment Formula One reminded everyone that even when you don't break the rules, you can still go too far.